Good to be back. We are going to be in Corinthians tonight. Before we actually get to the text we want to look at in Corinthians, what do we know about the church there in Corinth? What do we know about them? They were a messed up church, were they not? What were some of the things that we can think of that was going on at the church in Corinth? Okay, they're like taking each other to court, like suing each other in the church. Who knows?
The wealthy were eating while the poor were...
They were abusing the love feast, the Lord's Supper, and the wealthy were eating and getting their fill, and the poor and the lower class were being left outside and not able to share in that with them. And Paul got onto him pretty heavily about that. What else? A lot of sexual immorality going on in Corinth. Kind of in general, he talks about it in general, but then there's one chapter that's one specific thing that's going on, and that's it talks about a son sleeping with his father's wife, which gives the impression that it was his stepmom and not his biological mom, which doesn't make it any less bad or immoral, but I don't know if it was incest as much as it was just a weird situation. What else is going on? They're having struggles with what to do with food being sacrificed to idols and whether or not they can sit at those tables with people who are eating that food. And there's a whole discussion about that. There's a discussion about marriage and singleness and being a widow and being married to an unbeliever. And so it seems like the Corinthians had a lot of questions about that, confused about a lot of that. Whether it was all right to get married. You got that in there. You've got, right at the very beginning, you've just got divisions. I mean, some are saying, well, we follow this person, and some are saying, well, I follow this person, and others are saying, well, I follow this person. And Paul's getting on to them about these divisions that's going on. There's also what we're going to be spending some time at tonight is there's a lot of discussion about the worship gathering, the gathering of the saints to come together and worship. And it seems like there were a lot of issues going on in the middle of that. Not in one in particular, but just a bunch of them.
Big argument over which was the most valuable or important gift.
Yeah, arguing over spiritual gifts and which is the greatest spiritual gift. And if I have that spiritual gift, does that mean I'm greater than you are? You know, all this different stuff's going on. And so I always think it's interesting. You've probably heard this too, but I always think it's interesting when we talk about, you know, we need to model the early church. And I always want to say, which one? Because I don't want to be Corinth, because they had some problems.
Life would have been boring.
Life was, I'm sure it was not boring. But the truth is, all the churches had their problems. Just like all churches today have their problems. There's not a church in the world that doesn't have issues. Because we are humans and humanity is messy. And we irritate each other, and we see things differently, and we read things differently, and we have preferences for things that are different. We can read the same text and come to different conclusions. 2,000 years of history has proven that to be true. And so humanity just in general is just a messy thing. And Corinth is no exception to that. And so what I want to do tonight before we get into our actual study is I want us to look at probably the most famous part of 1 Corinthians, and that is what he says right in the middle of all this stuff about spiritual gifts and how the assembly should go. He's been hard on them about a lot of different things. He's trying to correct some abuses that they are doing. And in the middle of all this, middle of trying to figure out what to say about spiritual gifts, in the middle of trying to figure out what to say about the Lord's Supper, in the middle of trying to figure out what to say about the lawsuits and the adultery that's going on and the divisions that are going on. In the middle of all this, we have 1 Corinthians 13. And yet, I will show you the most excellent way. If I speak in a human or an angelic tongue, but I do not have what? Love. I am only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and can fathom all mysteries and knowledge, and if I have a faith that can move mountains, those sound like really good things, do they not? I mean, we are called to have a faith that moves mountains. We're called to be a people who can preach and teach the Word, such as like the prophets of the New Testament. Those are good things. But he says, if I can do all that, if I have the gift of prophecy, if I can fathom all mysteries, and if I have all knowledge, if I have the faith that moves mountains, but I do not have what? Love. I am nothing. If I give, here's something Jesus called people to do. If I give all that I possess to the poor and give over my body to hardship that I may boast, but I do not have, I gain nothing. Love is patient, and love is kind, and it does not envy, and it does not boast, and it is not proud. It does not dishonor others. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. It doesn't hold grudges. Love does not delight in evil, but it rejoices with the truth. It always protects. It always trusts. It always hopes. It always perseveres. Love never fails. But where there are prophecies, they will cease. And where there are tongues, they will be stilled. And where there is knowledge, it will all pass away. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part. But when completeness comes, what is in part disappears. When I was a child, I talked like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. But when I became a man, I put the ways of childhood behind me. For now we see only a reflection as in a mirror, and then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I am fully known. And now these three remain, faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love. I'm becoming more and more convinced that if you really, I was just going to say Paul, I mean Jesus started all this, but really if you get into Paul, because Paul's writing all these churches, I'm convinced that if you read Paul long enough, you eventually come to this conclusion that he really believes that the solution to any problem that we have in the church can be solved if we just love each other more. That it's not about more knowledge, that it's not about getting it all right, that it's not about anything else, giving it all away. It's not about having the best ministries and the best programs. It's not about having the best solutions and the best models. I'm convinced that Paul would say, if you love. If you just love. And that's more important, and I said this at the very beginning, that is more important to me than me convincing you of anything and you agreeing with me. I want us to love each other. To me, this is this study, because I realize that there are some who are who see things the way that I am seeing them. There's many in here who do not see them, and we'll just be honest about it. There's some who do not, and there's some who do. And for me, this is an exercise in not trying to convince anybody of anything. This is an exercise in us trying to love each other in the midst of disagreement. Can we love each other in the midst of disagreement? And so I haven't hit on that since the very first class. And when I got to Corinth today and started looking through stuff, I thought I can't start without looking at chapter 13 and realizing that the most excellent way is love. And that love treats people a certain way. Love believes a certain thing in people. Love is for people. Love is with people. And love is unto people. And so that's where Paul is in Corinth, and he'll talk about it in Galatians. He tells us in Galatians, love fulfills the law. Romans 12, he gets into this whole thing about love. Ephesians, we had a prayer meeting last night. The elders and the ministers got together, and we looked at Ephesians chapter 3, where he says, I pray that you will be rooted and established. And what I was shocked about was that so often we talk about being rooted and established in knowledge. Rooted and established in the Scriptures and a right understanding of things. But what Paul said in Ephesians 3 was, I want you to be rooted and established in love. And so over and over, Paul goes back to this thing about love. And so I want us to have that in the forefront of our minds, that this ultimately is about love. Whatever happens, whatever gets talked about, however we go through this, wherever we land, that we love. So, 1 Corinthians, let's just go straight to the passage that's right there at the top of the handout I gave you. 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verses 34 and 35. We know it well, especially if we've grown up in the churches of Christ. We know it very well. Women should remain silent in the churches. They are not allowed to speak, but must be in submission, as the law says. If they want to inquire about something, they should ask their own husbands at home, for it is disgraceful for a woman to speak in the church. This passage has posed a lot of problems for a lot of scholars, for a lot of students, for a lot of ministers. And it might be tempting to look at it and say, well, what's the problem? It seems pretty straightforward to me. And I would say that, yes, if you read those two verses in a vacuum by themselves, it seems pretty straightforward. But then if you step back and you look at some things, then you realize that there are some difficulties with taking that two verses at face value. And I call these on the handout textual difficulties. And the first textual difficulty is just the larger narrative, is what I'm calling it. The larger narrative. What do I mean by that?
The whole story.
The whole story. What we've been going through from the very beginning. From starting in Genesis, and we went through all the different women in the Bible who do different things. And Phil talked last week about Galatians and some different passages. It just seems like from the larger picture of the Bible itself, that itself already poses problems with taking this just strictly at face value. But I believe that we can even narrow it down and say that it is not just the larger story, but it's the Corinthian story.
It's not just the Corinthians. If you go back in the 11th chapter.
We're going to get there. Don't get ahead of me.
Well,
Take your time.
in this it talks about ask her husband.
We're going to get there too. Come on. You're jumping ahead. You're jumping ahead. That's not a very loving thing to do. Neither is me telling you to be quiet. But you're saying what I'm getting at is the Corinthian context.
You have to forgive me.
Well, there's lots of things that you and I forgive each other about. Yeah, I hear you say that quite often. So the Corinthian context, and this is kind of where he's going, what he's talking about. But the Corinthian context is narrowing it down. We see the larger picture of the whole Bible, but let's narrow it down just to Corinth itself. The Corinthian context. Chapters 11 through 14 focus on something that is very near and dear to our hearts in the churches of Christ. Chapters 11 through 14 deal with what? Worship. The worship service. The gathering of the saints when they come together to worship. The whole section, starting in 11 and going through 14, it deals with that very thing that is very near and dear to our hearts. Which is really at the core of this study in a lot of ways. That's what we're talking about, is what can or maybe cannot happen in a worship service. And 11 through 14 deal with the worship assembly. And when you look at chapter 11, let's look at chapter 11. Somebody read, it's going to be kind of cutting it off in the middle, but this will give us enough to give us the idea. Somebody read verses 1 through 6 of chapter 11. You want to do that? 1 Corinthians 11, 1 through 6. Okay.
Follow my example as I follow the example of Christ. I praise you for holding to the teachings just as I passed them on to you. Now I want you to realize that the head of every man is Christ, and the head of the woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. Every man who prays or prophesies with his head covered dishonors his head. And every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. It is just as though her head were shaved. If a woman does not cover her head, she should have her hair cut off, and if it is a disgrace for a woman to have her hair cut off or shaved off, she should cover her head.
Okay. We could keep going, kind of get the picture, but what I want us to see is that what he's doing in chapter 11 is giving instructions for how to properly pray and prophesy in the worship assembly, and guess who he includes? Who's he include? Who? Women. Women are praying and prophesying as right there along with the men in the Corinthian assembly in the worship assembly. Now, there are lots of things in chapter 11 that bring up lots of crazy questions that we could spend a lot of time in and get bogged down in. And if we want to, we will do that eventually. But I don't think that we necessarily need to dive into them right now to simply see this matter. And that is, can we all agree that Paul is assuming that men and women are praying and prophesying in the assembly together? And that's what it looks like. And that he does not forbid it, but it rather gives instructions for how to properly do it. Now, why does this pose a problem? Well, it poses a problem because why give instructions for how to do it properly in chapter 11 and then 2 chapters later or 3 chapters later then tell them that they can't do the very thing that he just gave them instructions on how to do? Does that make sense, what I'm asking? Yeah. If Paul really meant in chapter 14 that no woman could talk at any time during the worship gathering of the saints, then what is the point of including instructions for how women should go about praying and prophesying in chapter 11? Why not just skip all that and say, you know what, women shouldn't be praying and prophesying in the first place. They should all just stay silent. But instead, he says this about the thing. Yeah, Jim, go.
Just notice in verse 5, it says, but every wife who prays or prophesies, not every woman.
Yeah, we're gonna talk about that in a little bit because what's going to be interesting to find out is sometimes knowing Greek doesn't do you any good, and sometimes knowing Greek just lets you know how difficult it is to translate the Bible. And the problem with this, which is why you have a version that says woman and you have a version that says wife, is guess what? In the Greek, there's one word for both woman and wife. And the only way that you know the difference between whether or not it should be women in general or a wife is the context of the passage. And sometimes there's not enough context to give you that. And so you have passages like this where some translations, I'm not sure what you're using or what you're using, but like some of them, an NIV might say woman and the ESV may say wife.
I'm pretty sure mine's right.
And we're actually going to look at that in a little bit. I'm glad you brought that up because that's actually going to come up in a little bit. But that does show why sometimes it's not as clear-cut as it looks. Because Greek is difficult.
It's not just Greek. If you do any translating,
English is difficult.
Will you become aware of the fact that it's an artistic value? I was involved in a theological discussion not too long ago, dealing with some things written by Kierkegaard. And I was looking at it, and I went back to the original Danish, and I said, I wouldn't have translated it that way.
Yeah.
But then I went to see where that same guy had translated that same phrase in a totally different way in a different place.
Yeah. Yeah.
He was talking about Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac. This thing he did.
Yeah.
So
all languages are difficult.
Translation is not a one-to-one thing at all.
Yeah. I've heard people say, I just wish I just knew Greek, and that way I'd know exactly what the Bible says. And I'm always saying, no, you would not. It would just make you more confused. And so we'll get to that in a minute about the woman and wife thing, because there's another place where that will actually come up in our chapter 14 passage.
Yeah, someone might argue that in chapter 11 it doesn't really specify that it's in the worship service. Do we have any evidence that it's actually, other than the title propriety and worship?
The evidence is that he talks about their gathering right after this in verse 17. He talks about how their meetings do more harm than good. The other evidence is that he says that they are prophesying, and he will go on later to define what prophecy means. And he says prophecy is always for the edification of the church. That prophecy, the way Paul describes prophecy in the New Testament is that prophecy is not for the outsider. Prophecy is always for the insider. Prophecy is always for the edification and the building up of the church.
What does it mean in chapter 13, part of 8 through 11? But where there are prophecies, they will cease. Where there are
Oh, you're getting into stuff that's...
when the perfect comes, that will go away. So.
Yeah, this is off topic, but the way I was taught, and I'm not so sure this is what I believe anymore, but the way I was taught was that the perfect that was to come was the completion of the Bible. And that once the Bible was completed, then there would no longer be any need for prophecy or tongue speaking because we would have the text. The problem I have with that is that the whole section is about, that whole thing is about love and about the completion of love, when love comes in its fullness. And for me, I think he's talking about when Jesus comes back. There's going to be a time when Jesus comes back, when the kingdom is fully established, when love is fully in its place, that there will no longer be any need for this other stuff. That the only thing that will exist, because we won't need faith anymore because our faith will become sight. We won't need hope anymore because our hope will become realized. That the only thing that will still exist in the midst of that kingdom when Jesus comes back is love. That's my understanding of what he's saying there. That when he says there's going to be a time when prophecies will cease. And for me, that's when Jesus comes back and everything is bound by love and his love. That's kind of where I'm at with that. You have any thoughts on that?
Yeah.
I pointed at her. I know you have thoughts.
I'll pass to Rick.
Well, no, people are still arguing about what should be included and not included in the Bible.
Yeah.
This isn't something that was suddenly came down out of the sky and there it was.
Yeah.
You mean God didn't hand it to the obedient James and that was it? No.
All right, we're going to do some marriage counseling over here in a minute. But go back to Ben's thing. That's my understanding is that this whole section, because everything from 11 to 12 is about spiritual gifts. It's about the Lord's Supper. It's about having a hymn. It seems like that all fits together in one category to me. The only place that those things really kind of come to life in a gathered body is when we're together to worship. And I've heard people suggest that maybe chapter 11, when it talks about women praying and prophesying, when it talks about men praying and prophesying, that maybe what is happening is that there's two separate services. I can't find that in the text. There's no place anywhere in the New Testament that ever tells us that men and women worship separately from each other. And so I have a hard time believing. And if they worship separately, then what's the purpose of covering the head to show head and all that stuff, unless you're in the midst of people that you need to show that with? Does that make sense?
And being silent.
You know.
Why have you have a service that you're silent?
It's true. You have that issue in chapter 11. That brings up textual difficulties that we have both men and women praying and prophesying. So how do you make that jive with what he says in chapter 14 about women being silent? You know, we'll get to that in a minute. But that poses a problem that we have to be honest with, and we have to say, okay, that's a problem that's there, and we have to discuss it. What's interesting is anytime I've ever gone to chapter 11 to have a discussion, it's always about whether women should have head covers or not. But we never talk about the praying and prophesying part of it.
Well, as long as we're being scriptural, why are these women here bareheaded? Why don't they have...
Well, see, that's the other thing is,
What are we doing in a building?
Yeah.
Go
ahead.
Just to throw into the mix. You talk about if you know Greek, you just get more confused. Read in the 11th chapter, the 9th verse through the 12th.
You want me to read it?
Man wasn't created for woman, but woman for man. Therefore, a woman should wear something on her head to show she's under someone's authority out of respect for the angels.
Yeah, what in the world is that?
Yet, as believers in the Lord, women couldn't exist without men, and men couldn't exist without women. As a woman came into existence from a man, so men came into existence by women. But everything comes from God. Now, who sounds confused there?
That sounds pretty confusing even in English, doesn't it?
You gotta explain that.
No.
Let me give you a different version here.
Are you just want to mess it up even more?
No, I think this is clarified. It says God created lines of authority in order for His created word to function smoothly. Although there must be lines of authority even in marriage, there should not be lines of superiority. God created men and women with unique and complementary characteristics. One sex is not better than the other. We must not let the issue of authority and submission become an issue.
Is that notes from your study Bible?
Yeah.
But he created us equal, but he gave us different jobs to do.
Yeah.
See, in our culture, even that gets murky, because a lot of women can do the jobs that a lot of men do, and a lot of men can do jobs that a lot of women do.
Yeah, but they didn't find that out until after World War II.
All right, let's move on, and we'll maybe come back. Let's move on, and we'll maybe come back to this in another study. Here's verse 20. Where's verse 20? Verse 20 of what? Oh, chapter 14. We'll get to that one later. Here's the other textual difficulty in the notes that I have there. In 14, verse 34, which is our passage, Paul bases this in what? Starts with an L. The law. What in the world? What in the world is he doing basing this in the law? There's a couple of questions that this brings up for me. First, what law is he referring to? Is this an Old Testament law about women being silent that he's referring to? Or is this an Old Testament law about women being in submission, which are two different things that he's referring to? Is it a law about women being silent, or is it about women being in submission? Either way, I'm going to go ahead and tell you, we could sit here for the rest of the class and let you go through the old law, and you're not going to find a law that says anything about it. Even the most conservative of scholars who are more complementarian in that they believe that women should not have a speaking role and that men should. Even those scholars that believe in that still in this passage say, we're not real sure what law he's referring to because we can't find it. Their best guess is that he is maybe going back to the curse stuff in Genesis 3. But they're not really sure if that's it or not. And so that brings up an issue. Here's another issue with the law. And the bigger issue for me is that Paul, over and over and over again, in Galatians, in Romans, in Ephesians, in so many of his letters, over and over and over again, he reminds his believers, especially Gentile Christians, that we are not under the law. Over and over again, he talks about that. As a matter of fact, in Galatians, he gets so worked up about this that he talks about the Judaizers that want to make all these Gentiles adhere to the law and be circumcised. They might as well just go, and then he gets pretty graphic about what they should do to themselves. And so you have like Romans 16:4 14. You don't have to turn if you don't want to. Am I in the right place? 16 verse 4? No, I'm not in the right place. Romans 6 and verse 4 is what I believe. Okay, maybe that's not right either. Where am I at? Huh? Go ahead.
If you look back to verse 21,
Yes.
it introduces the law, and my Bible reference is back to Isaiah 28:11.
Okay.
Verse 21 says, "In the law it is written, by men of strange tongues and by the lips of strangers I will speak to this people, and even so they will not listen to me, says the Lord." So then tongues are for a sign.
Yeah. Okay.
But to me, that's part of the same discussion referring back.
Yeah. So
I'm not sure if that's correct.
yeah, I don't know either. I think I came across that too, but I'm not sure. I can't find my Romans passage, but it's a passage where he talks about we're no longer under law but under the Spirit. And in Galatians chapter 5 and verse 18, but if you were led by the Spirit, you were no longer under the law. Just over and over, Paul talks about not being under law, not being under law. Now, all of a sudden, when he's talking about women being silent, he refers to the law. And that seems a little, that confuses me.
Well, this is getting back to a big argument that even goes back earlier than that. If you go back into the Old Testament prophets, they complained about people following the law, the letter of the law, and ignoring the people with need, the widows and orphans.
Yeah, prophets really get into that.
If you go through the Gospels, Jesus condemned most severely the people, the leaders, the religious leaders who were pounding on the law and follow the law, and he was most gentle with the outcasts.
Yeah.
And I think if you go into the history of Judaism in this period of time, this was an issue because the temple was destroyed. The temple worship was destroyed. They were busy then setting up rules and regulations for the preservation of their religion and their ethnic group.
Yeah.
And so here you have people who are concerned about following a bunch of rules and are losing sight of the welfare of people.
Yeah.
And I think this is an issue that's reflected here. And in fact, you can go into some Jewish scholars, and they go into the New Testament to get some background on the feeling of what was going on amongst the Jews.
Yeah.
So this is a broader argument than just what we're looking at.
Yeah. The other thing I would say is that if by law he is referring to a teaching that is based on submission, not on silence, but on submission, then this is where we're going to get into what Jim brought up a while ago and Joe was talking about. Is this all women to all men, or is this wives to their husbands? Because I can find lots of passages, New Testament and Old, that refer to wives being submissive to their husbands. But I can't find any passages anywhere that refer to all women being in submission to all men. It's always the wife to their husband. Dana is not in submission to me. And my wife is not in submission to her husband. She's in submission to her husband. And Kate to me. And so if what he's talking about here is submission and maybe about wives, then this may, in my opinion, shed a little light on what he's getting at in chapter 14 about silence and what's going on there. So you can flip over. I've got more notes on the back. And so what I want to say is it seems pretty clear to me, and we asked this and you agreed, it seems pretty clear to me that Paul assumes, at least in chapter 11, that Paul assumes that women are taking some kind of public role in the worship gathering of the church. They're praying and they're prophesying. And even looking to the larger narrative of Corinthians, when he talks about spiritual gifts, he says stuff like this in chapter 12, verses 7 through 11. Now to each one, the manifestation of the Spirit is given for the common good. To one there is given through the Spirit a message of wisdom, to another a message of knowledge by means of the same Spirit, to another faith by the same Spirit, to another gifts of healing by that one Spirit, to another miraculous powers, to another prophecy, to another distinguishing between spirits, to another speaking in different kinds of tongues, and still to another the interpretation of tongues. All of these are the work of one and the same Spirit, and He distributes them how? Who? To who? He distributes them to each one, just as He determines. And then he'll go on to say in chapter 14, which is where our text actually comes from, starting in verse 1, he says, follow the way of love. But then what else does he say? Eagerly what? Eagerly desire spiritual gifts, especially the gift of prophecy. And then he goes on to say about tongue speakers. Those who speak in a tongue, verse 4, those who speak in a tongue edify themselves, but those who prophesy edify the church. I would like what? What does he say in verse 5? I would like every one of you to speak in tongues, but I would rather have you prophesy. The larger narrative to me paints a picture of Paul believing that God gives these gifts to everyone in the church. And it seems mighty unfair to me, and maybe that's selfish on my part to approach it this way. I'll admit that. But it seems mighty unfair of Paul to tell women to eagerly desire spiritual gifts that he's going to prohibit them from using. Why doesn't he just talk directly to the men there? But instead it's to everyone. I wish all of you would prophesy. I wish all of you would speak in tongues. He gives spirits to everyone, just as he desires. He gives it to everyone for the building up and the edification of the church. And so it seems to me, just looking at the Corinthian context, that Paul does believe, and the assumption is there, that in the worship assembly that women have a role, at least praying and prophesying, from what we can tell in chapter 11. So here's what I want to do. I want us to look at the larger chapter of 14 to get a bigger picture of what's going on. Chapter 14, Paul is concerned about two things. And it pops up about 3 different times in chapter 14. It pops up also in chapter 12 and chapter 11, but it pops up 3 times in chapter 14. And the two things are this: edification and order. He's concerned about edification and order.
Just a quick comment about prophecy.
Yes.
That is such a stumbling block for us collectively.
Yeah.
You know, it's because of how it was originally perceived as foretelling the future. That's the original stumbling block. But people don't understand that it is simply spiritual discernment, understanding what God is trying to communicate to us humans. And all of us have the gift of prophecy at one time or another.
Yeah.
And some of us have more of a gift of prophecy than others.
Yeah.
And women have a value in that too.
Yeah.
You can't ignore that.
Yeah, prophecy does become a stumbling block because it's a language that we don't use, and we do associate so much with
we're afraid of it.
Apocalyptic stuff, telling the future stuff, which is this much of prophecy in the Bible. The bigger picture of prophecy is what you said. It's sharing a message of God.
We're afraid of it.
Yeah, we're afraid
of that
word. And so, like I said, Paul's big concern in chapter 14 is edification and order, and a couple of passages just to kind of show that. Chapter 14, let's see, it's verse 26. What then shall we say, brothers and sisters, when you come together? Each of you has a hymn or a word of instruction, a revelation, a tongue, or interpretation. What does he say next?
For strengthening the church.
Everything must be done for the strengthening, or so that the church may be built up. 14 verse 33. For God is not a God of disorder, but of peace and order, as in all the congregations of the Lord's people. Verse 40. but everything should be done in a fitting and orderly way. In one chapter, he hits that 3 times. Everything should be done for the edification of the church, and it should be done in an orderly way, not chaotic. Which seems to be a very important thing for Paul in this particular chapter. And so, here's something that we miss sometimes in chapter 14. Paul actually tells, and this is the next set of notes there, Paul tells 3 different groups of people to be silent in chapter 14. He tells 3 different groups of people to be silent in chapter 14. Do you remember what all 3 of them are? Obviously, one of them's obvious because that's what we're talking about. So you can cheat with that one. Women, okay. So we got that one down. What's the other 2?
People that speak in tongues.
Tongue speakers and prophets. He tells, and if you have the NIV, you'll miss this, and some other versions, but if you have a more literal, like the old New American Standard that tries to stay as literal as possible, he uses the same word for all 3 of these. For prophets, he tells them to be silent. For tongue speakers, he tells them to be silent. And for women, he tells them to be silent. And that can be found in verse 28 is the tongue speakers. 14 and verse 28. He talks about speaking in tongues. He says, if anyone speaks in a tongue, 2 or 3 at the most should speak, one at a time, and someone must interpret. If there is no interpreter, the speaker should keep quiet. The actual word there is the same exact word that's used for women being silent. Then the New American Standard actually says he should keep silent in the church. He should keep silent in the church. Let them speak to themselves and to God. The prophets, 14 and verse 30. And if a revelation comes to someone who is sitting down, the first speaker should, the text says should stop. The actual Greek says should be silent.
And that's showing respect.
That's showing respect. And so 3 times, and the other one is our passage in verse 34 where the women are to keep silent. So 3 times in chapter 14, he tells people to be silent. Tongue speakers, prophets, and women. Now here's the question. Is he telling all tongue speakers to be silent? Just the ones that are without interpreters that might be contributing to the chaos and the disorder. Right? That's what we just read. If anyone speaks in a tongue, 2 or maybe 3 at the most, Paul says, he throws that one out there, should speak, but one at a time, and someone must interpret. And if there is no interpreter, then that tongue speaker should keep silent in the church. And so his silence to the tongue speakers is not to all of them, but only to the ones that might be contributing to the chaos by not following an orderly way of things. Does he tell all prophets to be silent? No. Only the prophets that might be contributing to the chaos and the disorder of what's happening in the body. They need to make sure they're doing things in an orderly way. And so he says in verse 29, 2 or 3 prophets should speak. And by the way, he's going to say something here that sounds backwards to us. Or at least it does to me. But it's Paul's way of doing it, so we're going to go with Paul on this one. It says 2 or 3 prophets should speak, and the other should weigh carefully what is said. And if a revelation comes to someone who is sitting down, the first speaker should stop. The first speaker should be silent, as the Greek says. For you can all prophesy in turn, so that everyone may be instructed and encouraged. The spirit of the prophets are subject to the control of the prophets, for God is not a God of disorder, but of peace. And so, here's what's backwards about this. He says, if you're up there prophesying, you're in the middle, like if I'm preaching on Sunday morning, and I'm in the middle of my sermon, but then all of a sudden Rick gets a revelation from God, normally we would say that he should what?
You should be silent.
But we would say today that you should wait your turn and let me finish, which you really have a hard time doing. But that's what we would say, right? In our time, our culture, we would say that it's polite not to interrupt the person talking, but wait. Paul says, if the guy sitting down has a revelation, you who are currently prophesying, you sit down and stop so the second guy can get up and say what he's going to say. That sounds so backwards to me. But it's what Paul says to do. So, Rick, if you have something to say in the middle of my sermon, I guess I have to let you.
Thank goodness.
let you do that. I guess same goes for you, Doris. If you have something to say, I guess I should be quiet when you have something to say.
Well, she had a father who did the same thing.
So here's the question. Both of these groups, it's not a blanket statement over every tongue speaker and over every prophet. It's rather, he's talking to order and edification, and he's talking to those who might contribute to the disorder and make things less edifying by not waiting your turn or whatever. So my question is it possible that this might shed some light on what Paul is saying when he refers to women being silent? Is it possible that just like he's not speaking to all tongue speakers and he's not speaking to all prophets, that it's possible that he's not also speaking to all women?
He's just speaking to married women.
Okay, maybe it's married women. Maybe it's married women.
More than one place.
Maybe it's married women. But as I read it, I look at that and I have to ask that question. He doesn't mean every single tongue speaker and every single prophet. They have a role to play and they have a certain time that they're supposed to speak. So is it possible that he also does not mean every single woman? But that maybe he's rather referring to certain women who like the tongue speakers who were talking without interpreter need to be silent, and like the prophets who were not waiting for the other, not giving a space for the other one to get to speak. Maybe there are certain women who are doing something to contribute to the chaos and the disorder of the service itself.
Yeah, not every married woman. Just married women, but not every married woman.
Okay. Yeah. And I know where you're going with that because... Okay, I know where you're going with that. And we'll look at that in a minute.
Still, there's this sentence that says it's shameful for a woman to speak in church.
Yeah. And we'll get to that too. Maybe. I've got like 5 minutes. So we may have to come back to it next week. Your husband's taking up a lot of my time.
It's for your own good.
Yeah. Rachel? Yeah.
And so while they may be gifted and we were gifted with gifts of prophecy and tongues, just like men, they also didn't have the education to understand maybe some of what was going on. So it makes sense, like a child who wants to know what's going on, that they would be asking questions while things are going on and trying to explain.
And we keep, Rick and Doris and Rachel have kept hitting on this one particular aspect of it, and we haven't really pointed it out, but you keep talking about asking questions. And it seems like that's the context of being silent. I don't get the impression that he's stopping a woman from prophesying, because he's already told them in chapter 11 they can. And I don't get the impression that he's stopping them from praying, because he's already told them in chapter 11 that they can. He says that women should stay silent, and if they have any questions or inquiries, then they should be asking their what? Where?
So this is done where? This is a service in a church?
Sounds to me like this is in the middle of a service.
Okay, you're going to start a building, but still,
It sounds like a gathering of the church for a worship gathering where there's prophecy and where there's tongue speaking and there's praying.
The priest or a rabbi or whatever that had, well, that would be kind of interacting if people were asking him questions while he's trying to share what he feels he has to share.
Yeah, that to me makes the most sense.
We don't do that to you when you're...
No, you don't do that to me. That it would be wrong, I think. Now, I'll admit this is an assumption on my part, but again, thinking about the fact that each letter is written to a specific church for a specific reason, and a lot of times, and even in Corinthians, we know this for a fact, that he's writing in response to something that the Corinthians wrote him and asked him. I would say it would be wrong for a man or woman to do that, but apparently that's not the issue that's happening in Corinth. It's women that are doing it, and that's why he's addressing the women.
And tell them to speak to your husbands.
Go home and speak to your husband. Here's a question. What about those that aren't married? Or what about those women that aren't married to Christian men? Are that they just out of luck?
I think we're coming at this from a background that misses the point here. They didn't have buildings; they met in their houses.
Yeah, they met in their homes
It was
anyway.
much more like a life group.
Yeah.
But it was like a worship service in a cathedral or even a formal church service.
Yeah.
The bottom line is, it's clear here that they were being disruptive.
They were being disruptive.
He says, wait and talk to your husband. From what I'm seeing here, it was specifically the married people, and he says, wait until you get home, lady, and ask your husband.
Yeah.
Because you're
disrupting.
being disruptive.
And that brings shame.
Clearly says, but everything should be done in a fitting and orderly manner. So keep quiet until you get home and then straighten it out.
Yeah.
Right. The problem isn't that they're women. The problem is that they're being disruptive.
Yeah.
The tongue speakers.
The tongue speakers are being disruptive. The prophets are being disruptive.
But
in ways.
specifically
right here.
The women were being disruptive at that particular time, and he's saying, wait till you get home.
Yeah.
And he's telling the tongue people to wait, and he's telling the prophet.
And the disgrace part that Doris brought up a while ago, where it says, for it is disgraceful for a woman, if we believe this is wives, then it's disgraceful for a wife, probably because it brings disgrace upon her husband if she's calling him out in the middle of a service, questioning his prophecy, questioning his tongue speaking maybe. It would bring disgrace upon him to do that, and so they are to wait until they get home and have those questions.
Rachel touched on this, I think, when she said the women were not educated. Also, this is new. Christianity is new. This is something that these people don't have any experience with, really, and so they're trying to get it started, and they're meeting in homes, and I think what I think is probably more like our small group, maybe a little bit larger than some of our small groups, but to me, it is certainly speaking to a particular group of people here, but to translate that over into our culture, where women are educated, where we need nice buildings that are comfortable and they're heated and air conditioned. And it has occurred to me that if we sat down and listed how people worshipped in the early church, where they worshipped, and then we sat down and we talked about how we worship and where we worship, it would really be quite different.
Yeah.
So why are we getting so?
Okay, I was going to say, well, no offense, but women, it's kind of hard to get along with each other.
That happens in Philippians. He gets on to Syntyche and Euodia.
Yeah, and so with the women and not being
Yeah. Yeah. And that's to me why I started with chapter 13 about love, because this can be so, it's not just, well, it says it, we do it. There's some mess here. And I'll admit there's some mess here, and that's why we should let love guide us in how we approach it. To go back to something real quick, I'll end on this. N.T. Wright tells a story about a missionary who does a lot of work in the Middle East. His name is Ken Bailey. And he visits a lot of churches in the Middle East. He does a lot of preaching at churches in the Middle East. And he said that even today in the Middle East, it's not uncommon for in a church service, even a Christian gathering, a Christian church service, for men and women to be separated, men on one side of the room and women on the other side of the room. And what he talks about is that in the Middle East, men are educated and are often bilingual, whereas women only know the street language and are very rarely ever educated. And Kim Bailey told the story one time about being in a church service in the Middle East, and the preacher was preaching his sermon on one particular Sunday, and many of the women, it was kind of going over their head. And so they started getting bored, and when you get bored, what do? You start fidgeting, start whispering. And so they started getting bored, they started whispering, and the volume of the chatter got so loud that the minister stopped his sermon, and he said, "Will you women please stay quiet?" He went on. Talking died down for a little bit. A little while later, it got louder again. He stopped the second time. Will you please stop? You're interrupting. They got quiet. It happened a third time. And the third time, this is why Kim Bailey tells the story. The third time, the minister stopped and he said, "Women, if you want to know something about what's being said, then ask your husbands when you get home." He was quoting Corinthians because they were getting chatty and they were asking questions and talking and all this stuff. That's in the Middle East, which is way more relevant to the biblical text than our culture in the U.S. I realize that may not be exactly what's happening in Corinth, but it does seem like it could be very plausible that that's what's happening. And after all, if chapter 14 really is about order and decency in the worship gathering, then that would make a lot of sense to me. And so, as I look at these texts, as I look at it, I just find it hard to believe that Paul would be forbidding men and women from being able to exercise spiritual gifts. That's the key, being able to exercise spiritual gifts. But that what he is silencing is women who are not exercising spiritual gifts and who are disrupting the service. But he's also doing that with tongue speakers who are abusing their spiritual gifts and prophets who are abusing their spiritual gifts. And that what Paul is ultimately concerned about in all of this is making sure that it's done in decency and it's done in order and that it's done for the building up of the body. But even more so than just being for the building up of the body, he gets into in chapter 14 before the women passage. If you look at verse 22, he's concerned not just about the building up the body, but he's concerned about the building up of those who would come into the service from the outside. And I would imagine if tongue speakers were talking out of turn and prophets were doing whatever and women were disrupting the service, I would imagine this would be very hard for an outsider to come in and go, "What is going on here?" And he says, "Tongues then are for a sign, not for the believers, but for the unbelievers. Prophecy, however, is not for the unbelievers, but for the believers." So if the whole church comes together and everyone speaks in tongues, and inquirers or unbelievers come in, will they not say that you were out of your mind? They would say that if they came in and a bunch of people were disrupting the service and all this stuff too. But if an unbeliever or an inquirer comes in while everyone is prophesying, they are convicted of sin and are brought under the judgment by all, as the secrets of their hearts are laid bare. So they will fall down and worship God, exclaiming, "God is really in this place." And so it seems like Paul is not just focused on what would be best for the church, but Paul is also focused on what's going to be best for the outsider that comes in and is exposed to the gospel for the first time. Would we as a church be doing something that would put them off and that would make them say, "God is not in this place"? Or are we doing things in such a way that they would say, "God's in this place. God's moving among these people"? And I think for Paul, he would say, if you're using your spiritual gifts in a healthy, orderly way that's for the edification, that's going to happen every time. So that's where I'm at with that. We'll come back next week and I'll open it up at the beginning for you to just kind of give me some feedback on that. I meant to do that tonight, but like I said, Rick took up so much of my time. And we'll come back next week and see where we go from here. Thank you. I love you.